So I'm going to tap into actually kind of an old project that then is renewed in this context, sort of. So I changed my title to a question mark because I'm always a little bit in doubt about everything. And since Alessandro also asked me to go back to this project that I'm going to tell you about as well, that sort of failed in terms of becoming a distributed archive, then the question is really what we do about it. But still the subtitle, Rewriting Collective Care Beyond Storage, is valid. It's what I'm going to talk about. And I'm also tapping into this idea that we worked with when I was in Roskilde in the 90s and the zeros, inspired by Mark Weiser, this idea of the world is not a desktop. I mean, even if we are tapping into all these technologies, we need to remind ourselves sometimes that actually what we are dealing with is also outside the desktop. I mean, that makes a lot of sense in itself, of course. But somehow that is the momentum, so to speak, of what I want to talk about. So I have a plan. I will start with where is it? I mean, this unarchiving silent agency, and silent agency is a term that I use these days in the project I'm engaging with. I'm going to expand on that in a moment. But it's about this exciting and very sad case as well of the MAP Media Art platform from 2004 to 2008, which I built and constructed as a curator in Roskilde, but which consequently and later was pulled offline and then disappeared into containers, and now its status is unknown. I'm going to give a few examples from 2007, the MetaView and the Audiobar, which is an attempt to make this kind of distributed archive, or we call it a distributed museum, actually. I'm going to talk a little bit about this contextualization that has arrived since, this idea of the unheard avant-garde, the silent agencies, with the case from Pia Arke, which is the Greenland artist I'm mentioning in my abstract, and her project called Tubilacusaurus. I will detail that later, what that means. And then I'm going to discuss a little bit and go into this failed, I would say, attempt or failed status of the museum as the medium of archives, and what now? I mean, how do we move beyond that? And who cares for what now is my kind of anecdotal title for that. And I have this example from Al Hansen, which is from the archive as well, that if I have time, I will show you. I also brought my DVDs and all kinds of stuff, because the archive is not online anymore, so I have stuff lying on DVDs, if you even and tapes and stuff. So, and then we will go into concerns. I mean, that is maybe where we are going, really. I mean, where are we going with all these things? And since I'm a curator, I may tap into this in different ways, and obviously than the artistic sensibility does. I tend to go into policy making and these kind of actually boring things as well. So let's move into it. Where is it? This unarchiving silent agencies, what are they about? And as I'm also in my abstracts, I'm quoting Wendy Chun, this quote about memory is not a storage. Memory is not something that simply remains. If any memory remains, it is because it's constantly regenerated. So this idea of rewriting, of inscribing and exscribing is something that stays with me in my way of talking about archives. Alessandro was talking about, it's not really about the formats, but it's about you could say the politics of how we bring care into this distributed archive. I would say that there's maybe not a format, but there's a reformatting happening of some sort, and this is what Chun is pointing out. So it's regenerated. The conflation of memory and storage is dangerous because it fosters a misleading ethos that forgets the collective care and effort, good and bad, that goes into any memory. And this spoke to my curator heart somehow, because what I met in 1999, when I was hired, actually exactly 25 years ago yesterday, I was hired to take care of an archive and the research at this Museum of Contemporary Art in Roskilde. And contemporary art is a metaphor for maybe more like Fluxus time-based, time-sliced, or microtime temporality that media archaeology later talks about. This kind of contemporary, it's not contemporary art in the sense that we talk about it today. So what I met was this huge archive of Fluxus, Danish Fluxus mostly, a lot of mail art, and a lot of sound and a lot of video, and nothing of that really tapped into any category that the art historians were telling me about was in the art world these days. So there was something about the art world and what it accepted, something that was going on that I couldn't really make this archive happen from this material that we already had in the museum. It was not really an archive yet, so it was more like this silent agency. And so the term silent agency arrives later. It comes I edited a special issue of a Danish magazine where we use this term as the umbrella term for a renewed focus on the specific situation of unmediated relations and otherwise muted formations which are unarchived, and that those are a shared matter of concern to which new artistic and curatorial practices need to attend. This is it's a journal Seismograph, a Danish journal. So in this talk and in this journal as well, I addressed the situation of countering any type and countering another type of silence, that of certain research culture, in which, as Latour is voicing here, a mute researcher designates a phenomenon that expresses itself silently on its own while imposing itself without any sign or intermediary on a totally passive human being, clearly not a very realistic situation. So there's certainly a challenge here, not only of the artist, but also especially, I would say, of the curator and the researcher in a very broad sense. How to operationalize this in a way so you could say, archive what is unarchived at this stage. So my PhD was also on an unarchived Danish media art group that was called Showbigs. I'm not going to talk about that. I would just say it to explain that it's kind of following me this focus on unheard avant-gardes and silent agencies, things that are not archived yet. And what do we do about it? How does that attention even appear? So I was also in my current research, I'm looking into what we were talking about biases yesterday. I think there's more than bias in the workings here, because there's something that Howard Becker suggested of an art world that sort of constitutes what's included and excluded. For now, let's say that there are aesthetic systems that includes. I have found 5 at least of those systems that are active today. If anyone are interested, I can maybe exemplify them in the Q&A because it will take too long to go into them. But they are active in the way that we include anything in what we call an art world, what would receive money, what goes into archives, what receive our attention, and also what people want to see in the museum, and so on. And these things are active, and we use them actually also curatorially, I discovered. And so back in the day, I was curious about why couldn't I actually get all this wonderful material from Fluxus and all things into this archive? It was, I mean, the reason I got when I called around, of course I called around and said, what do we do? Was that there was no category for it. Okay, but then we could maybe invent a category. And then it was said that because back in the day we didn't register, as it was called, anything digitally, so it was not really a matter of a format as such. But it was more about consciousness and about this awareness, and did it really fit in this art world? There was something about this aesthetic system that was off. So I decided to make my own platform, my own sort of interface, my own archive, if you like. I'm not sure if it's an expanded archive at least, with all these wonderful things. And we did, actually inspired by Peter Weibel text from 2004, where he, in the 25th Jubilee of Ars Electronica, writes about transdisciplinary practice. It's a wonderful text. I said, okay, I just got inspired and formulated this project, transdisciplinary project, with a special focus on the archive of this museum. And what I wanted was to operationalize these liminal boundaries that I found was there between an archive and using computing as a kind of a way to make the museum into an interface, the physical space into a kind of an interface. And I did this to counter this very conservative and very biased and very kind of exclusive aesthetic system that I found was operating around all museums, actually, and the way we could make these Fluxus things and all these sound art pieces part of an archive in an official museum. And we used to term the distributed museum as a way of reformulating the political and aesthetic contract between the museum and the public sphere. I mean, I don't know, that's very zero-ish or 90-ish, I don't know. I mean, that was what we did at the time. We can discuss this. I don't know if that's true anymore. I think there's a huge problem with the whole museum world as such, and I think we agree on that, so we can talk about that. But the whole idea was to renegotiate the competences of the archive and the art museum in the 21st century. And of course, we had some key instabilities I wanted to work with as well. We have all these art formats, what do we do? We have mediated technical, we heard about this yesterday as well. The uncertain, unresolved, how do we operate with that? Documentation is an extremely limited resource, but mostly it's the only thing we have. Non-synchronic staging, most of what we had was really not in an art museum context, sorry. So how, when we bring it back, what then? So the whole question of exhibiting and so on. Interaction with context and problems of authorship, the basic of aesthetic judgment shift. It's not the same art world all over, and so what do we do with that? And so this whole reformatting or rewriting and unwriting of an archive became a very kind of distinct thing that I wanted to work with in hopefully in a way that it becomes a creative engagement with the public as well. And somehow often, especially the Fluxus, I would say, the object of art is supplemented by information rather than an actual artwork. I mean, often Fluxus is just not just, but it's a score, and then it's a chair or an apple or something that fell on its head or something, you know, stuff like that. Wonderful stuff. So, really short, long story, very short. We sat down. It was a group. I invited 10 people, transdisciplinary, all kinds of. I mean, there were computer people, there were designers, architects. There was a real database geek as well. There was a sound person, artist, and the curator myself was sort of outnumbered, which was important. And so we worked 4 years actually to create something that then materialized into several projects, and I want to showcase 2 of them. One was, which was actually my dream, to make a meta view, an overview of the entire collection, which was huge. It was not only huge in terms of works, it was also huge in terms of the relations between the works and the collectivity that was there. It was not only caring about the works, I felt, it was caring about the collectivity of, especially you could say, the Fluxus community, which was very strongly collective, even if they argued a lot internally. But also the sound artists, which was completely undescribed at this time. There was no sound anywhere. I mean, in ZCAM, I met one, Peter Weibel, that was interested, and his people. I met Klaus Schöning in Cologne as well, who was also working with this, and David Tube in London, but not in an archival sense as such. I mean, yes, in ZKM. But. So I want to showcase what we did. This was the meta view, using the very early form of Unity, made the whole collection navigational through a bent screen in the museum space. So you could use it was a modified WII remote that the audience then could use to navigate through a universe basically of digital and non-digital or analog elements. So all the white dots are digital, all the gray are in the below this white kind of screen is analog objects. So what we found and discovered was that everything in the collection and everything in the archive shared one thing, that was metadata. So everything had something about registration, some data. But we also wanted to register or to archive the relations between them. So it's a collectivity. It's not only the works, and in the logic of Fluxus that makes a lot of sense as well. In sound art, which is a very wide term, and at the time it was really laptop music and noise mostly. There was, you could say, this idea of also a community that was really strong. And so that seemed also to be an important factor in itself, that we wanted to showcase all these places where things were being made, the creative dynamics of it. It's after all not the museums that made them. I mean, no, it was actually kind of the opposite. We were just sort of maybe receiving something of it if we put attention to it. So another project we made in this, of all the projects, I'm showcasing two of them. The one was MetaView I just showed, and this one is the Audiobar, which we are actually still showing. So it's been touring a bit. So I'm just... Det er Brian Eno.
Den faste står deroppe, er det sådan en hemmelig...
Undskyld, hvad er den?
Så den faste står allerøverst, er det sådan en hemmelig flaske?
Ja, det er sikkert en, der har mistet sin chip. Skal vi gætte på det? Det er jo de der RFID-tags, de river af en gang. So, we thought, what do we do with sound? We had this huge collection of sound art, all kinds. From, I think the 1890s is the first piece, and then up till 2004 or something at the time. And we also wanted people to engage with sound as a sensitivity or sensibility. I mean, something that you sense and hear rather than, oh, this is a sound piece and we want to hear this one. So we digitized the whole collection with all kinds of formats. We kept, of course, the originals, but we digitized them in different formats, so they were all valid, and put them into a database, and used this RFID technique at the time, very new. It was not even legal yet, so new it was it. And every bottle has an RFID tag underneath. And what we did was to ask ourselves, how do we then metaphorize? I mean, it's metaphors of sound. How do we describe sound when we listen to it or to talk about it? How do we talk about sound? And we found that there were 12 pairs of concepts that we mostly used when we talked about sound: high, low, machine, man, these kind of concepts. And so every bottle represents one of these concept pairs. And we had a music student to listen through the whole collection of 5,600 sound works and just give his subjective opinion. Is this more machine or more man? So we had these sliders that maybe is more machine. So every time you take a bottle, you have a new kind of pair of, this is more man, this is more machine. You put it on the table and it finds something randomly in the database. You can also mix your drinks. So it becomes this social, it's not shown here, but you can really mix. You can put 10, 15 bottles and get a soundtrack. What you don't know yet while you're listening is really what is the piece you're listening to. So you are opening your ears and then you can go to a screen afterwards and see a playlist. But the whole idea was to play with the space as an interface, as a social space of interfacing with sound art. So in this sense, we were with intent moving away from the small screen, the desktop, and into a bigger screen or a prolonged screen or an expanded screen, using the museum physical space as the medium, you could say. So what also went along with this project was, of course, that we archived everything. We played with the digital technology, but also the actual archive setting, which is always a kind of balancing of digital and analog elements. There will never be one golden solution for everything. So actually every work was digitized in 5 different formats. And we had then the analog in maybe 3 different formats, if it was video, and 5, I think, tape formats, analog formats, 5 different if it was sound and so on. It's crazy. So we had this archive that exploded, but most of all, I think the most valued part of it was really the metadating, that we had to go through everything and find the relations and actually archiving that as well. So back to the silent agencies, because all this disappeared, unfortunately. I stopped in 2008. There were directors later that took it more seriously, this thing with contemporary art, because that became a genre then suddenly, right? Contemporary art today is something that we have museums for. It's something that has become so gentrified, it's almost, I'm sorry, but maybe it's not that interesting anymore in my view. So that the following directors wanted to have more contemporary art and was looking at the artwork as the vehicle of the archive rather than all other kinds of things that, for instance, Fluxus was and sound art was part of. So they excluded all these things from the museum, and also put down the online thing we had, which was a really nice resource, just textual resource. And then lately they also, because they moved out of their buildings, this is a long story, they put the whole physical analog archive into a container, which I lately heard that they don't know where is. So we are really in trouble here. So first it was a very nice, I don't know if you agree, but I think it was a nice project, and there was a good vibe around it, and then it became really a tragedy, sort of. And so we are here, right, discussing what to do now. And I want to take this into the archive fever again, because there's something about the archives that not only are bogging us down, but they also sort of pushing us forward. If we're bringing something back, we also bring it back in a new context, and the context seems to be, and the relationality seems to be something that is really important here. And Derrida, he writes, an archive is an economic in this double sense. It keeps, it puts in reserves, it saves, but in an unnatural fashion. That is to say, in making the law normous or in making people respect the law. So this, for me, speaks in an interesting way into this point I have about aesthetic systems and the art world. And of course, if you have aesthetic systems of inclusion, and we know them, there's an aesthetic of a perception, there's an aesthetics of conceptual aesthetics, there's an aesthetics of context, there's an aesthetics of technology, which is mostly, you could say, post-phenomenological aesthetics. And then there is one of networks, which is also, to some extent, reaching into the idea of infrastructures and so on, which has, you could say, the two latter ones I mentioned is, for instance, Ars Electronica on the one side, and then Transmediale in Berlin. They are both having each their own aesthetic system to operate from, I would argue. And these aesthetic systems are, of course, paradigms of inclusion, but per inference, they are also excluding something. And, by the way, they are all European and Western. And so, suddenly there was a larger perspective on this kind of operationality of the Western art world and how we construct them, because there are several, that speaks into what is a post-colonial situation as well. And this is where I want to speak about Pia Arke. And this is, of course, also from a very specific Danish context, since Greenland is the post-colonial theater of Denmark. I don't know if you're aware of that, but it's a place that Denmark currently is part of the Commonwealth of Denmark or whatever. They have self-rule, but it's certainly a post-colonial situation, of course. And so Pia Arke is unfortunately not with us anymore. But she was one of the first I came across in the 90s that were speaking to this very, you could say, problematic, but also in her case, I guess, in a certain way, also an inspirational, if you could call it that, momentum for herself to ask, what then? I mean, how do we break out of these, what I call the aesthetic systems? When you study in an academy in Copenhagen, but do not, I mean, the moment you return to your Greenland position, as she explained to me, it becomes this kind of ethno-aesthetic. And that's not really what she wants. I mean, she wanted to create her own space, so to speak, make her own way of expressing herself and the pain that she had been experiencing. So this is where I'm gonna attach my DVD, because I have the material from Pia Arke on a DVD here. Let's see how that goes. And what I want to show you is an archive project that Pia Arke did actually in Museum of Contemporary Art in Roskilde. Oh, it works, but surprisingly, yeah. You remember these interfaces from DVDs. So, since this archive is not online anymore, and I cried a lot about that, but I stopped crying now, so I actually had a lot of these works that are in the archive, that were in the archive on other media, so I do still have them, and it returns to me sort of to suddenly have this vast material lying around. And one of these is the selected video works of Pia Arke, and this is one of the discs. And so she did this project Tubilacosaurus. And just to explain briefly what Tubilaca is this thing that that hunters, Inuit hunters, make before they go on a hunt. And they make them, originally they made them partly from bones of dead animals and maybe even children. And made this kind of chimera monster sort of that could scare away all the combatants so they could shoot the right animals and so on and not the competitors, the other hunters. They could also be made to scare away people that maybe were enemies of other sorts. So they are these kind of, you could say, ritual, mystic figures, chimeras or actual figures that they made. So, but when the Danes arrived and the Nordics and the Americans as well in Thule, it became sort of an interest by these Tubilaka. So in Greenland they talk about the Tubilak tourists. And what Pia Arke is doing is of course to play on this kind of post-colonial situation of having all these tourists, and it's still going on. I mean, now it's climate tourists that comes in and buy all these Tubilaks. To make a Tubilacosaurus, a sort of a survey, a sort of scientific survey of the Tubilak. So it's an interesting study. It's a typical way of her to talk about this, an interesting study about the Triassic myth of Kapstoch. And so this is interesting because it not only shows Pia Arke working also with archives in her own way, but it also showcases the you could say the situation of having these silent agencies that addresses these gaps that the aesthetic systems that surrounds us and are formulating our art worlds with all kinds of biases and include and excludes from a post-colonial perspective. So let's just see a little bit of it. Yeah, and it should be subtitled for English. Can you see anything? Yes.
Ja, vi befinder os på Geologisk Museum i København, og jeg, der taler her, er afdelingsleder Svend Alexander, som i mange år har beskæftiget mig med Østgrønlands uddøde virveldyr. Og det er et studium, som jeg blev introduceret til af Ejken Nielsen, Dr. Ejken Nielsen, som også i mange år arbejdede med virveldyrene på Østgrønland. Hans speciale var trias, det vil sige dyr, der har en alder af 200 millioner år. Han arbejdede i 30'erne på lavkomsekspeditioner på Østgrønland med indsamlinger. Og i årene 1932-33 overvintrede han for første gang oppe i nærheden af Eskimoernes på Kavnø. Og på den anden side af Golf, som det hedder, en stor bugt, der går ind, ligger Kapstoch-området, hvor han i de forskellige geologiske lag fra trias-tiden blandt andet faldt over det stykke, vi har her, som han senere fik lejlighed til at studere og beskrive i trykbeskrivelse og give navn tuberkulose.
Man kan lave tuberkulose på forskellige måder. Enten finder man et barnelig, som man skyller liv i, og siden omskaber og udruster med forskellige farlige egenskaber. Eller også skaber man selv et helt nyt væsen, i det man går frem efter følgende fremgangsmåder. Det er alle slags dyrsættelser.
Yeah. Okay. So I will stop here, but that's just to give you an example of you could say a very peculiar aesthetics as well. She has this slowing down. She wants us to go into a different mode. She also wants to create this kind of space around this myth, this part real, part unreal situation of this Tubilak and Tubilacosaurus. I also think that the way she uses media is quite distinct, and she's one of the early ones that really are, you could say, pursuing a way of finding a third place for herself as she formulates it. She writes a dissertation even that is called Ethnoaesthetics at the Art Academy in Copenhagen. They had to write a dissertation. It's excellent, by the way. It's also been translated, so I can only recommend reading it. Also, if you want to be maybe moving a little closer to Greenland aesthetics, which she, as I said, she's terming this kind of third place for herself. Not European, not Western, but not really Greenlandic either. I mean, that's very specific in her writings, that she doesn't want to sort of be only in the Greenland context. She wants to find something completely new. She also is very aware that what she's addressing, and I think this speaks to Jada actually, is everything aesthetic about, non-unesthetic about aesthetics. So she's in a way terming also this, I mean, the Western sphere and the art world of the West is really constructed around these aesthetic systems that we include and exclude based on the paradigms that follows from them. But in this way, she's actually in a way creating a non-aesthetics for herself, something that is not about aesthetics really, but is something that comes out of this European situation of aesthetics. And this quote, the ethnic condition is ironic, she says indeed. On the one hand, by our own example, we are a necessary external contribution to the European self-perception. On the other hand, due to exactly this self-perception, we are not quite matching the European superiority and must generally remain a sadly outdistant supplement, an unbearable reminder of the ethnic, the political, the economic, in short, of everything unesthetic about aesthetics. I think it puts the whole situation on, yeah, it makes it uncomfortable, but it also puts it on the brink here, right? I mean, we might look into a big void of stuff that we were not aware of when we were talking about this archival situation. After all, what are we distributing? And also my question before, who is it that we want? Where does the care come from? I mean, that is a big question, I think. So there's something about moving beyond the museum as a medium of archives. Who cares for what now? That really occupies my my thinking at the moment. And I wanted to tap back to James Putnam, who wrote this book, The Museum as Medium, Art as Artifact, back in 1929. And who also, by the way, in this book explains how the curator is the original caretaker of collections. And I was thinking that is really something that we have forgotten or is, I don't know if I want to move back to that position actually. I know from a professional point of view that yes, you do take care of stuff, but On the other hand, the caretaking that we are talking about here is a different one, right? So there's something about how to address this whole idea of the museum as medium that for me is something that we need to go further with and expand and explore. And this quote, using its institutional power, the museum forms the ultimate arena for artistic discourse with the recognition that art is a dynamic force continually in a state of flux. I would seriously question today. I mean, and he's writing from the point of view of British Museum, by the way, because that's where he was a curator. So it's not really an art museum context he's thinking about. It's a much wider context of museums, especially the cultural, historic, and natural historic museums that have had this influx of artistic way of expanding on their way of exhibiting and so on. But I think there is a huge problem here that speaks to the very fact of how we then turn our attention to all these unarchived things. I mean, where do we discover them? I'm quite sure we don't discover them in museums, I have to say. I found another thing, which is actually a digital file I had from a film from the archive of Al Hansen. And I just want to show this as an example. It's also an example of stacking things. We saw Pia Arke stacking her books before and sort of wanting to play with this scientific idea of accumulation and giving proof and evidence of something, which also speaks to how Denmark became the power of Greenland by accumulating the proof of we have been in this place and that place and this place in Greenland, and finally got the approval from whatever international institution in the 20s. So that's mimicking that. In this case, Al Hansen, who is one of the founders of so we're jumping a little bit in time as well, is one of the founders of the happening genre. Living rough in New York, he was half Danish, the father of Beck, the pop musician, by the way. Even if it's misspelled by the guy who recorded it back then, Al Hansen, but it's Al Hansen. These flukes and mistakes in the archive are proliferant, I can tell you. I wanted to show you this. It's from 1985. It's the same time approximately from the surveillance footage from East Germany. But this is from Copenhagen. And it's in a cafe, and he has his 55th year's birthday. He's talking about why he's called Hansen, and you have this kind of anecdotal. He's then stacking these Danish open sandwiches with butter on them, and accumulating this kind of superfluous culture that he finds in Copenhagen. He used to live rough in New York. But it's just an hour you spent with this guy, Al Hansen, who was part of the factory and this crowd in the happening community in New York. And he talks about art, how it's always ephemeral in a way, that he wants to build new relations between what he actually does when he lives, the way he lives, and what art is, and so on. It's just to showcase this variety of stuff in the archive that was lost, and how we can re-find these things is maybe the big question that I'm asking today, and work with that in a distributed archive setting. Yes, so even if that was not a perfect way of showing this example, I want to move on to my finishing points, which are the concerns and reflections, which I think are the things that are coming out of this, how we are navigating these systems of inclusion and exclusion, using a term from complexity theory, which is this idea of hinterland, what is behind our decisions, behind the biases, behind what we do, behind our methodologies, how to speak to that in a proactive way, in a maker's way. To a great extent, I have really no idea, but I have some concerns that might bring us close to, and I'm also hearing in the room when you're presenting that there are certain hopes and ideas that could be moved further ahead to meet some of these, and even to have this whole NIMI focus on this topic is helping as well. But there's something about the bottom-up approach that always tend to create bottleneck problems, so there needs to be this concern of how to you could say operationalize also the difference between these different bottom-up approaches in a way that could move us in a right direction and make more attention towards these unarchived materials. And I specify these are materials that I find are not archived normally. I mean, it's only our attention that really brings this to an archive. Again, to repeat, the world is not a desktop, so attention not only to online and digital worlds, but also to formulate what constitute a distributed art world that is really here. I mean, that's a strange way of saying it, but something that goes beyond the desktop is I think interesting to think about. Policy making, that's so boring, but it's something that needs to be done somehow, and something I think this project is also speaking into. Are there any alternatives to institutions? This has been asked so many times, and there's a long history of that. But it might be interesting to think about in network strategies, actually. So there's something in this. And then I had this notion that if we have networks, like a bit like your idea, Alessandro, would have this kind of distributed network of archives, then we would need at least 5 parallel or more parallel archives. So if one of them dies out, then at least there's the others as backup. I don't know if that makes sense. And also I have my own sub-project that's really, I'm concerned about those people that are hired in institutional positions that has to somehow work with this, and I'm not very hopeful, I have to say. I think the boards around and I can compare with when I worked in the museum world 20 years ago, they are not taking any chances anymore. There are no room for people that actually might fight for some of this in that world at the moment. And how could we change that? So we need a methodology. We're back at where we started. So I made a full circle back to actually state the same thing that Alessandro stated in the beginning. Yes, so of course Foucault was there, we had media archaeology. There's something about, it's difficult to have an archive in its totality, something about the micro-temporality, but I don't think I will go into that now. It's just a furthering of how to develop that methodology, maybe. So actually I will end here and open up for questions, I think, and just showcase some of the transdisciplinary archive practices here. So thank you.